What kept a family alive when the sun vanished for weeks? How did communities in the far north turn wind and snow into allies instead of enemies? Why did their houses look, at first glance, more like boats than shelters? They called the Longhouse a hall, and the hall held more than bodies and beds. It held strategy. From the first lightning raid at Lindisfarne in 793 AD to the last flickers of Norse settlement in Greenland in the 15th century AD, people living across Scandinavia, the North Atlantic islands, and the fringes of the Arctic refined an architecture of survival. This was not accidental. It was cumulative knowledge. Observations sharpened by years, by winters so uncompromising that a single design mistake could kill. In fragments of timber, in layers of turf, in the soot-stained rafters recorded by archaeology and the sagas, a coherent logic emerges. These were houses engineered to hold heat, to marshal wind, to remain dry and, where possible, to outlast the storm. If you find the ingenuity worthwhile, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. The story begins before the Viking Age proper. Timber longhouses existed in Scandinavia for centuries during the Iron Age. Halls of timber and turf appear across the archaeological record from Norway's fjords to Iceland's volcanic plains. By the late 8th century AD, those forms had evolved into the long halls that we most readily associate with Vikings, elongated structures sometimes reaching tens of metres in length, framed in timber, roofed with turf, and centred around a hearth. Excavations at places like Hedeby, Heithabu in present-day Schleswig, the Chieftain's Hall at Borg in Lofoten, and the turf house complexes of medieval Iceland show recurring patterns of plan and detail. Archaeologists debate the exact timelines and local adaptations. The dating of phases at specific sites is frequently contested. But the broader continuity is clear: a shared, practical architectural language for living with cold. At the scale of the individual building, the first thing to notice is geometry. Straight, rigid walls present a blunt face to wind. They take the full impulse of gusts, and where the wind meets a right angle, pressure differentials make drafts inevitable. The solution northern builders favoured was a curvilinear logic. Longhouses were not rigid rectangles so much as gently convex vessels. The ends of the hall, the small gables, were the faces presented to prevailing winds. The long sides bent slightly outward, their profiles sweeping the gusts away. This is not mere poetic description. Fluid dynamics, airflow around convex forms, reduces separation and turbulence immediately adjacent to the structure. And the Vikings, through repeated trial and error, arranged their walls so wind would glide past rather than batter. We can see this principle in the largest known halls. At Borg in Lofoten, excavations revealed the footprint of a hall restored at the Lofoter Viking Museum, a structure up to 83 men long in its grandest phase. That length mattered. A large internal volume slows the pace at which interior air cools. Thermal inertia does work for you. The hearth's heat diffuses across a bigger mass of air and heated surfaces. And the mass of turf and timber stores energy. It is an ancient architectural battery. Yet long length alone was not enough. The orientation and siting of each hall were deliberate. Builders observed local windroses for years, often orienting the long axis east-west to capture the low winter sun and expose the narrow gables to prevailing winds. Entrances were rarely placed on the windward face. Vestibules, side extensions, and covered porches acted as buffer zones where cold air could shed temperature before the interior was entered. In some settlements, houses nestled together, cheek by jowl, creating shared leeward courtyards, where children could still play while the sea howled beyond the perimeter. The village functioned as one big, thermally aware organism. Roofing was perhaps the most radical and effective part of the system. Modern insulation gurus often marvel that the Vikings used earth, turf and soil as their best thermal layer. The principle is simple and stubbornly effective. Earth has high thermal mass and very low thermal conductivity when dry. A thick layer of turf resists the rapid loss of heat and smooths diurnal and seasonal temperature swings. Yet the technique required craftsmanship. On top of a robust rafter system, the Norse set a waterproofing layer, birch bark where available, that is recorded both in archaeological finds and in later vernacular practice. Birch bark resists rot and sheds water. When overlapped like scales, It forms a durable membrane. On top of that were layers of turf, sods cut from meadows with intact root mats, and vegetation. The first layer might be laid grass side down to interlock roots with the bark and compress. Subsequent layers turned grass side up and became living turf. Roots knit the soil into a coherent mat. Over time, the roof becomes monolithic, growing rather than merely covering the house. 1/2 metre of turf, layered and living, traps air, dampens wind noise and stores heat. Snow that settles on such a roof is not a burden to be fought. It is a complement to the insulation. The roof's geometry, steep pitch approximately reminiscent of an inverted keel, encourages shedding of heavy accumulations while retaining a softer snow cap that insulates further. Turf roofs are not a panacea. Their weight demanded powerful structural solutions. The rafters and posts of a longhouse were hefty, designed to take many tons of earth. Archaeological timbers from Iceland and Norway show posts of large, often resinous species. Braced and pegged together, so the roof load distributed to a series of internal supports. These interior posts, arranged not as a single straight file, but often in slight arcs, created an internal frame that resisted both downward load and lateral wind thrust. At the same time, the curved internal frame helped air to circulate. Warm air, rising from a continuous hearth, reflected off sloping surfaces and returned to the inhabited zone. Convection did the work of fans, form directed flow. The central hearth was the beating heart. Many halls featured a long central fire, a hearth following the lengthwise axis. Cooking pots hung from tripods or iron hooks over the flame. Flat stones set into the pit acted as thermal accumulators. These stones, chosen for their ability to withstand repeated thermal shock, absorbed the fire's energy during burning and released it slowly after the flames died. The practice of a lazy fire, feeding longer pieces of wood gradually or allowing coals to smoulder under ash overnight, meant heat was sustained across the long polar night without constant labour. The hearth placement mattered beyond convenience. A central hearth minimised heat loss through perimeter walls and distributed warmth evenly to benches and sleeping platforms along the sides. The absence of chimneys in the modern sense is often misunderstood. Where chimneys channel smoke rapidly upward and out, the Viking solution embraced smoke as a functional layer. In a tall, triangular roof volume, a layer of smoke would collect beneath the ridge, forming an insulating layer that blocked radiant heat loss through the roof timbers. The smoke rose from the central hearth, accumulated in the high point and, if allowed to stagnate, acted as a barrier between warm air below and the cold sky above. Controlled openings at the ridge, sometimes adjustable with simple wooden shutters operated from the floor, allowed excess smoke to escape. This is an operation of trade-offs. Too much egress, and you lose heat. Too little, and smoke descends to living height. Skilled firekeepers regulated combustion, fuel types, and venting to keep the smoke line above head height for most activities. Archaeological studies of soot deposits on preserved rafters and turf timbers support the widespread presence of this long-term smoking of structural elements. The carbonisation of wood surfaces also acted as a preservative, making beams less susceptible to rot and insects. At moments, this arrangement has been misrepresented in popular accounts as a primitive blunder. They lived in choking smoke, but that is a myth worth correcting. Smoke was an environmental control. It preserved, insulated, and processed food. Meat and fish hung in the smoke attic, where low, steady smoking preserved supplies needed for months. Far from being merely tolerated, the smoke cap was harnessed. Of course, health trade-offs existed. Cooking indoors has respiratory implications, but the net survival benefits in Arctic winters were decisive. The idea that a conventional chimney was always superior ignores the thermal calculus of an uninsulated pipe in Arctic wind. Venting via controlled roof openings kept more heat inside than a conventional flue would have in many circumstances. Dryness was another front line. Moisture is heat's relentless enemy. Frozen water expands and tears wood apart, and wet soils conduct cold directly to the house. The Vikings invested enormous effort in drainage and foundations. Before any wall rose, builders scraped away the rich, water-retentive topsoil. Foundations were beds of large stones, gravel, and sand compacted to create an air cushion and to permit macroscopic drainage. Ditches and channels led melted snow and runoff, away from the settlement. In many excavated sites, the remains of such drainage features are evident. Posts were never carelessly sunk into peat or damp earth. Their feet were often charred, an antiquity technique of charring wood to create a resistant collar, and set on flat stone so that the timber did not directly touch the soil. Raised flooring, where present, allowed ventilation beneath boards, keeping the living platform dry and the subfloor timber from rot. In especially wet zones, builders used double stone walls filled with earth or gravel as a damp-proof barrier. The obsession with dryness was not mere fastidiousness. A wet house would be a cold house, it would also decay and fall apart. Inside the hall, people organised space with thermal logic. Raised benches running along the sides, platforms often half a metre or more above the packed earth, created living zones that sat in the warmer strata of air. Under these benches, storage for tools and firewood was common. The void acted as insulation. Sleeping boxes, chests or curtained alcoves conserved personal warmth by reducing volume and leveraging body heat. Rich households or chieftains might have bed units, lined with furs and curtains. But even poorer families use skins and layered wool textiles because wool retains insulating properties when damp. The layout thus offered a temperature gradient. The coldest place at ground level, a warm living band on the benches, and a hotter zone directly above the hearth and under the ridge. That stratification is an engineering choice. People aged into it, moving to where temperatures suited activity. Village-level design reflects the same rigorous pragmatism. Buildings clustered with deliberate spacing to reduce wind tunnels. Storage houses, smithies, and barns formed a windward buffer protecting residential halls. Often a communal hall dominated the settlement's centre. A single large hearth serving many people was more efficient than many small fires. Shared fuel economies mattered when timber was a precious resource. The annals and Scandinavian sagas hint at cooperative efforts, neighbours pooling labour for roof repairs, and communal stores, and the archaeological record shows large communal buildings that have no single household signature. The social structure and the architecture reinforced each other. A community could survive where an isolated household might fail. We must not assume homogeneity. Local materials and ecosystems produced variation. In wooded Norway and parts of Denmark, post and beam construction with vertically laid split logs was common. In treeless Iceland, turf and stone houses dominated. There, double stone walls with an interior filled by earth and pebble created thick, insulating walls, exceeding a metre in places. Far from crude, they rival modern insulation by mass. In exposed coastal sites, builders adapted roof pitch and wall curvature to the relentless sea wind, while in sheltered valleys different solutions held. This variety is a strength. The architecture is best understood as a flexible toolkit, not a single recipe. Documentary and ethnographic evidence buttresses archaeologists' reading. The Landnámabók, the medieval compendium of Icelandic settlement compiled in the 12th and 13th centuries AD, and other saga literature preserve references to turf houses, birch bark roofing, and the importance of drainage and site selection. Folkloric practices, roof returfing by neighbourly teams, careful birch bark maintenance, persisted in Scandinavian vernacular architecture up to the 19th and even 20th centuries. Institutional memory did not vanish with the age of sail. It persisted as practical know-how. A myth that recurs in popular imagination is that Vikings slept in freezing, drafty huts and suffered smoke inhalation fatalistically. This is inaccurate. Archaeology shows regular maintenance, sophisticated assembly of materials, and intentional control over interior atmospheres. Another myth to dismantle is the idea that turf roofs were primitive and merely a stopgap until better materials arrived. In truth, turf roofs are a rational adaptation to specific climates. Where timber scarcity, persistent winds, and low solar gain prevail, turf is a sensible insulation strategy and remains in use in parts of Iceland and Norway into the modern era. Rather than a sign of backwardness, turf architecture represents ecological intelligence. We can see specific moments where the built environment adapted to technological and social shifts. With increased contact across the North Sea and the Baltic from c. 800 to near 1000 AD, ironworking improved and woodworking tools became more sophisticated, which allowed for larger spans and more precise joinery. Shipbuilding technologies influenced house building and vice versa. The inverted boat analogy is not just metaphor. The curvature of hull timber joinery and the understanding of rib-like framing translated into internal roof trusses and arched braces. The Oseberg ship burial, interred c. 834 AD in present-day Norway, and the Gokstad ship, buried c. 900 AD, are dramatic technological statements about woodworking skill. Their existence suggests that craftsmen capable of shaping large timbers with curvature and tension were available to build large roofs. At the site at Borg, for instance, the Grand Hall's reconstruction demonstrates a knowledge of long-span roof construction that likely demanded shipwright-level expertise. Food preservation and smoke are tightly interwoven in the thermal story. Smokehouses and storage lofts above the hearth use the same physics of warm, rising air and low oxygen to create environments where meat, fish, and dairy could be kept. Salt was a limited resource in many northern economies. Smoking and drying were indispensable for preserving protein through the winter. Therefore, the smoke cap was simultaneously an insulator and a processing chamber. Archaeological residue analysis from fish bones and charred adhesives confirms smoking and drying in spaces tied physically to domestic hearths. Hearth management had social and gendered dimensions. In many skaldic and saga references, maintaining the fire is a woman's role. The mistress of the hall is the keeper of coals, manager of cooking and preservation, and planner of the household economy. This is corroborated in ethnographic parallels and in the division of labour visible in tool assemblages found in domestic contexts. The matter-of-fact organisation of roles contributed to the thermal efficiency of dwellings. Steady, disciplined fires, careful fuel preparation, and cooperative household routines matter as much as architecture. One of the most persuasive proofs of the effectiveness of these systems is the survival of settlements in places that would challenge modern houses without central heating. Norse settlements in parts of Greenland, founded by Eric the Red in c. 985 AD and persisting for centuries, survived centuries of cold, though not forever. The Norse colonies on Greenland eventually declined for reasons that remain debated. Changing climate, economic isolation, soil erosion, and cultural choices are all invoked. But the architecture and clothing systems kept people warm for generations. In the North Atlantic Arc, the Norse presence at Lanceau Meadows in Newfoundland, i.e., 1000 AD shows that a people accustomed to Arctic winters could transplant both their maritime and their sheltering technologies across oceans and survive in new, harsh landscapes. Modern experimental archaeology and reconstructions have tested some of these ideas. Rebuilt longhouses and turf structures across Scandinavia and Iceland, occupied seasonally by researchers, consistently demonstrate how the combination of central hearths, turf mass, and controlled venting creates a remarkably stable interior environment. These projects are not flawless replicas. Some details remain debated, but the experiential evidence supports the archaeological interpretations. The houses were warm, livable, and resilient. Ethnographers documenting later vernacular architecture have recorded the same functional choices: overlapping birch bark, regular returfing ceremonies, and the social labour involved in maintaining the living roof. There is, however, no single textbook prescription. The details mattered: the species of timber available, soil types for turf, the local wind regime, and the social scale of the farmstead. In some places, stone and turf combinations were necessary. Elsewhere, timber-framed halls with wattle and daub walls filled with dry moss were used. Even within a single region, building phases reflect incremental improvements, climate shifts, and social changes. The archaeological stratigraphy at multi-phase halls often shows periodic re-roofing, underpinning, and internal rearrangement. That dynamism is a reminder that the Viking house was not a static artifact, but a continuously tended technology. Consider the paradox of light and darkness. In modern terms, we prize windows as ports to the outside. In northern medieval houses, windows were scarce because every hole in the armour was a path for heat to escape. Thin membranes, treated hides, oiled cloths, or stretched bladder served where transparent panes were unavailable or too fragile. Occasionally, thin plates of horn or mica could be used where light was needed, but glass absent or expensive. Placing openings high in gables or in small roof lights limited conductive loss. The result was dim interiors that emphasized warmth over daylight. In winter, daily life was choreographed around the hours of sun. In summer, the same architecture provided refuge from midnight light. The aesthetic consequence, interiors steeped in smoke-lit shadow, was not a failure but a deliberate compromise. Let us turn to craft details that clarify thermal logic. Joints and seals used materials with hygroscopic properties. Moss, wool, and animal hair were packed into gaps because they swelled when wet, forming seals that resisted wind infiltration, even under prolonged rain. Moss also resists rot. Where tar and resin were available, they were used to seal seams. Tarred ropes, resin-treated hemp, and birch tar provided durable caulking. Local experimentation determined what kept air out most effectively. In many contexts, such circumstantial chemistry was as valuable as large timbers. Maintenance rituals are worth a separate paragraph, because thermal systems break down when people do not sustain them. The returfing of a roof required coordinated labour, cutting, carrying, and overlaying sods, and neighbours often assisted. In spring, when snow retreated and the sun returned, roofs needed attention to patch leaks and renew birch bark membranes. Everyday behaviour, sweeping hearth ashes into designated pits, raking glowing coals to feed the simmering embers, hanging damp garments by the warm smoke attic, was part of the technology. The house was a living apparatus requiring steady human stewardship. Climate variation through the Viking Age complicates easy narratives. The so-called medieval warm period, roughly c. 950 to 1250 AD, and subsequent cooling phases influenced settlement patterns and building choices. Some scholars argue that milder temperatures in the early 2nd millennium AD opened the North Atlantic to more extensive colonisation and agricultural experimentation, while the later Little Ice Age contributed to stress on peripheral settlements. These climate reconstructions are continually refined. There is no unanimous consensus about precise timing and effects. Yet the adaptive architecture we have described provided resilience across a range of conditions. It is also important to recognise what the houses did not do. They were not sealed boxes in any modern sense. Ventilation happened through gaps, doorways, and planned openings. This exchange was essential to avoid noxious stagnation and to keep stored food from moulding. Heat was managed, not hoarded to the point of asphyxiation. The architecture produced comfortable zones, not a uniformly warm environment the way a modern, central heated house might. People accepted, and organised around, that gradient. A practical example helps to crystallise the interplay of features. Imagine a hall built on a slightly elevated knoll, its long axis oriented east-west, gables facing northerly winds. The builders scrape off turf, lay a bed of stones, and set posts on flat rock pads. A birch bark membrane is layered across picked and oiled planks. Rafters are raised in a gentle arch, supporting a half-metre of turf. Internally, a central hearth extends along the axis. Flat stones collect heat, and iron cooking hooks and kettles form part of the system. Benches run along each side, covered with skins and woven rugs. Curtained sleeping boxes cluster at the far ends. On storm nights, the smoke mounts under the ridge, a grey blanket that reduces radiative loss. A neighbour brings replacement turf in a communal labour ritual in spring. The house survives a series of extended storms. The drainage channels around it keep the subfloor dry. That single vignette contains dozens of adaptive decisions. We must touch on language and terms cautiously. Old Norse terminology for household elements survives in the sagas. Scholars have translated hearth, hall, and roof terms into modern parlance, but usage varies regionally. The concept of a long central hearth is recurrent in both archaeological layout and in the textual corpus. But precise vocabulary and its semantic range can be disputed. It is important to present such elements as part of a living, linguistic and material culture, subject to regional differences. The materials also played symbolic roles. Turf roofs tied dwellings to the soil that grew food. Birch bark, prized for its sealing properties, carried the scent of the forest. Smoke imbued clothes and tools with a patina of home. The architecture was material culture, yes, but it was also identity. Living under turf, sharing a hearth and tending communal roofs tied people together not merely for warmth, but for social cohesion. That cohesion mattered where an ill-timed storm could change everything. I should bring up one more mythbuster: the idea that straight lines and sharp right angles are necessarily superior to curved forms for domestic comfort. The architectural preference for convex curvature in some longhouses was not aesthetic whimsy, it was performance-based. Curved profiles ease wind stress and help maintain a stationary layer of calm air adjacent to the exterior surface. Inside, the absence of cold corners reduced condensation and damp points. Where straight walls were used, builders compensated with thicker insulation and tighter caulking. There is no single correct geometry, there were context-specific answers. But the presumption that our modern orthogonal houses are automatically thermally optimal is false. Archaeology and experimental reconstructions have addressed specific technical questions. Heat retention experiments in reconstructed longhouses measure how turf mass and central hearths affect internal temperatures. These studies demonstrate that, depending on outside conditions and hearth intensity, internal temperatures could be held well above freezing without continuous stoking, especially when the turf was dry, the roof intact, and snow cover provided additional insulation. Those reconstructions are not perfect real-world simulations, but they consistently show the basic principle: mass plus controlled combustion plus weather-smart siting. And maintenance produce survivable internal climates. Longer-term cultural effects arise from this architecture. Settlement patterns, agricultural schedules, clothing styles, and social organisation all co-evolved with building technology. For instance, more clustered settlements encouraged shared labour and trade, which in turn affected political structures. Conversely, where households remained isolated, greater self-sufficiency was required in planning and construction. The house is not just a shelter, it is an engine of a particular pattern of life. We should acknowledge limits and areas of scholarly debate. The exact efficiency of turf roofs compared to modern insulation is often quoted in popular media with numbers that vary widely depending on assumptions about material, thickness, dryness, and maintenance. There is no single efficiency percentage that universally applies. Likewise, details such as the precise arrangement of ridge vents or the nomenclature for smoke openings are patchily documented. In some places, written records are thin and archaeologists must infer function from soot patterns, post holes, and soil chemistry. The claim, sometimes repeated, that Norse houses retained up to 80% of heat because of the absence of chimneys should be treated cautiously. Such claims are context-dependent and often lack a standardized experimental basis. Present these figures as indicative of significant retention, rather than as absolute quantifiable proof. What can modern builders learn? There is a renewed interest in green roofs, thermal massing, and passive solar orientation in sustainable architecture. The Vikings' approach, treating the house as a living, maintained system rather than a sealed appliance, has lessons for durability and resilience. Consider the birch bark membrane. It is a natural waterproofing layer that endures for decades if well laid. It is recyclable and locally sourced in many biomes. Turf roofs can be part of a low-carbon strategy when timber and turf are in balance with the local ecology. But adaptation matters. A turf roof transplanted into a wet, leaching temperate valley without proper drainage will fail. The success of ancient techniques depends on their ecological fit and the community's capacity to maintain them. Before we close, a vital clarifying moment. The Viking house was never a monolithic, unchanging invention that spread unchanged across the north. It was a family of strategies, combinations of mass, geometry, ventilation, and social labour, shaped by local conditions. Where forests offered abundant timber, wall techniques differ from treeless Iceland. Where the sea drove stinging, salt-laden winds, shapes and orientations adjusted accordingly. The image of a single Viking house is a simplification that obscures rich regional variation. Return with me, for a final reflection, to the central mystery. How did people without modern materials or mechanical heating keep warm in the Arctic dark? The answer is both simple and complex. It was simple in principle. Mass plus controlled combustion plus intelligent siting equals survivability. It was complex in practice. Timber trade-offs, drainage engineering, coordinated labour, and cultural routines, all these mattered. Across centuries, Norse builders learned to convert the elements into allies. Turf and snow became blankets rather than burdens. Smoke became a stabilising cap, rather than merely a nuisance. Wind was deflected rather than stubbornly resisted. Their houses were climatic machines, tuned by observation, adjusted by craft, and maintained by social rhythm. We began with 3 questions: the survival of body and community in polar nights, the harnessing of wind and snow, and the design logic that made roofs resemble the undersides of ships. And we end with an image that both answers and deepens the puzzle. The long hall, with its curved walls, living roof, and smoky crown, is a deliberate, multi-layered solution to a relentless environment. It is not a relic of ignorance. It is a record of practical intelligence encoded in timber and turf. If this tour through cold, smoke and stone stirred